Hello, Art History. This is Mr. Smith. So, last time we left off, we explored New Kingdom temples in Egypt. We talked about the relationship between the Temple of Hatshepsut with the Temple of Amun-Ra. Obviously, we're looking at the Temple of Hatshepsut here. The Amun-Ra temples on the other side of the Nile River. And of course, they're on the same axis, right? Facing towards the solstice, facing towards the Valley of the Kings, where people are buried. That's one of the reasons why we call this particular temple here a mortuary temple. It was thought that it might be possible that Hatshepsut, in her burial, that her body was brought here to be prepared for arrival in the realm of the dead. But we don't actually know that for certain because we don't have her body, and her body wasn't buried here. And that's important to note, and I'm not sure if I made that point last time. This is not a tomb. It is a temple. And we also discussed how there were lots of hieroglyphs here and paintings here that talked about, an expedition to the land of Punt, which was a mythical land probably somewhere in Saudi Arabia, where they brought all this vegetation and plants back. And so, while a tomb is really sort of an exploration of the afterlife, right? Hatshepsut's temple is really an exploration of Hatshepsut's life and the ceremonial life, kind of the ceremonial life of Egyptians, right? And so this is really a temple that's sort of focused on what Egyptians do in their daily life, or at least maybe not daily, but this really is and this is true also when we talk about the Temple of Amun-Ra. We want to be talking about Egyptian beliefs. We want to be talking about what they believe specifically, like Amun-Ra, or like the setting of the sun and things like that. Their practices, and we described this intricate practice. Where we believe that they would take the cult statue from the sun temple, from the Temple of Amun-Ra. It would cross the river, sort of symbolizing entry into the realm of the dead, and then cross over and then come up here, and then it would rest. They would rest the statue inside this doorway where we would find these statues of Hatshepsut kneeling. It's exceedingly rare to find an image of a Egyptian pharaoh in such an act of piety, right, where they're kneeling before someone. Granted, she's holding these jars. These jars have been interpreted in a couple different ways. Some people see them as canopic jars, and a canopic jar is a jar that is utilized for holding the internal organs of a mummified body. But others think that they might actually be more symbolic than that. They might be sort of like spheres that represent heaven and earth, thereby signifying this idea that the pharaoh, controls as a god, controls both parts of heaven and earth. Which is interesting, because if you could imagine that if the cult statue of Amun-Ra was standing in front of her, looking down on her as she kneels before him, that it would be very much like almost a sort of recreation of the kind of image that we saw on the Babylonian Stela of Hammurabi, where Hammurabi is pious and praying to Shamash, who's also a sun god, in order to gain his right to rule. And spread his law code. So those are really interesting concepts. Other really interesting concepts that come up with the Temple of Hatshepsut and these depictions of Hatshepsut are how we explore and how we depict questions of power and authority. And I'll just talk about this briefly because, Hatshepsut was a woman and she has a beard in this image. And so it's such a clear-cut case of how iconography is a language. And if you don't speak it, then people won't understand, right? And the idea that a pharaoh always has this sort of like beard, on his chin, signifying his wisdom and his stature, right, is so interesting because, like, if that is the case and she's a woman and she can't grow a beard, how do they display her pharaonic, glory? Well, they're just going to put it on her anyways, right? Because that's the language that they speak. So those are really interesting things to consider there. It's a really fun image to look at. So as we move through, we have to look at we spent a lot of time on architecture in ancient Egypt. We have not looked at a lot of the sort of art images like the papyrus and the sculpted images and things like that. And so that brings us to this piece. We're going to look at a few pieces together. We're going to look at this piece here. We're going to look at the sarcophagus of King Tut or Tutankhamun. We're going to look at this piece here, and I'm trying to think if there's one more. I think that's it. Yeah, and then we'll kind of end off with this. So I want to start with this here. And for those of you who are looking at this, you may notice that this is a really strange image. You may notice that it doesn't really look a lot like the other images that we've seen. In fact, even the way in which it was carved doesn't even seem to be very much like the other images that we've seen. You'll notice that there are things that are strangely missing. So, for example, this is an image, and I think you can tell this because of the crown, right? This is an image of the pharaoh and his wife. But this is the pharaoh, if I remember correctly, his name was Amenhotep IV. You don't need to remember that because he changed his name. He changed his name to Akhenaten. And the concept Aten is actually an important concept. The concept Aten translates to loosely something like the sun, right? And I don't remember exactly how this worked, but over several hundred years, and I remember the New Kingdom spanned for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, but over several hundred years, and you see this in the Old Kingdom too. In the Old Kingdom, the sun god was Ra, right? By the time we get to the New Kingdom, we have the sun god being Amun-Ra, right? So you started with Ra, and then you had this sort of like melding into this concept of Amun-Ra, and then now you have this sort of concept of Aten, which, if I remember correctly, Aten is the sun itself as opposed to Amun-Ra, that is the god of the sun. And what Amenhotep IV did is he had seen that the power of the cult of Amun-Ra had grown incredibly powerful, like we saw with Hatshepsut, and they actually had become more powerful than the pharaoh himself. And he decided that their sun worship was only for the sake of power. And his reasoning is hard to sort of like figure out exactly because so much evidence has been destroyed. But he did something exceedingly unique in the 2,000-year history of ancient Egypt. He decided to convert to a monotheistic version. Monotheistic. This is probably one of the first monotheistic religions in history, apart from Judaism. So he converted to a monotheistic religion in which there was only one God, and that God was the sun. And he forced everyone to convert to that religion so that the temples of Amun-Ra and things like that would no longer have power, and there would just be the worship of Aten, the sun. And in this image, we see some interesting iconography. We see this disc up here, which is probably the sun, right? But you'll notice that the disc is giving off rays of light. And if we look at the ends of the rays of light, we see all these little interesting sort of things. Some look like petals, plants, but others, you may notice, you've seen that symbol before, probably. It's the Ankh. It looks something like this. It's a cross. It's loosely like a cross with a loop at the top. And the Ankh is a symbol of life. You may have seen some cool people that you know with tattoos of the Ankh because it's so cool to get a tattoo of an Ankh. I'm joking. Anyway, so it's sort of this clear sort of iconographic indication that Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti, this is Nefertiti over here. You may have heard of Nefertiti because one of the most beautiful depictions from the New Kingdom era is actually a bust of Nefertiti. I don't have it in this image set, but you'll have the chance to look it up. It's incredibly beautiful, and it's beautiful in a way that's almost disturbing because it fits our modern conceptions of the standard of beauty in a way that is sort of surprising, but that's for another time. Either way, we see the sun reaching out to Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti and giving them these ankhs, right? And also reaching out to their babies, their children. And their children are funny because their children are like, and this is a Greek term, which is a fun term. Their children are homunculi, and a homunculus is like a fully grown human that's the size of a child. And I don't know where the term originates from. I think it originated in the Middle Ages. But we see it here not as, not truly probably because the artist made specific choices. Hey, I'm going to represent them that way. Even though I know they're babies and they're children, I'm going to represent them as fully grown humans, maybe because there's a specific style that I'm going to stick to. So these are fully grown humans with these really elaborated, the rear portion of their skull is stretched out. Sometimes we nickname them tiny alien babies because they look a little like tiny alien babies. But what's so fascinating about the image, and we won't see this throughout the 2,000-year history of ancient Egypt, is that they're climbing all over their parents, and their parents are kissing them, and they're pointing, and it's one of the most playful images. It seems as though that all of the rules that we associate with ancient Egyptian art have been kind of thrown out. I told you before that it was so important in ancient Egyptian tradition to ensure that if you're going to utilize the image for the soul to rest in, it has to follow all these rules. Well, in the time of Akhenaten, because of the religious change has led to an artistic change. Those rules that we saw before applied specifically to that polytheistic religion that existed in Egypt. Well, now that they've changed religions, those rules no longer really apply. Yes, there are still some things like the frontal eye versus the profile head, and the frontal torso versus other things being. Actually, it's kind of interesting. It looks like it's frontal up here, but then actually when you get to the belly is in profile, and so even some of those things have been kind of thrown out. And so it's a really fascinating image that does not fit with any of the records of ancient Egypt. Now, here's what we know, and this is a few important things to point out. When Akhenaten died, his predecessors destroyed they tried to wipe away the existence of Akhenaten. They wanted people to go back to before Akhenaten like it never happened. They went immediately back to their polytheistic ways, and they systematically tried to destroy his tomb, all of the sculptures. And so there are a few of these things like this piece here that are found inside of the tomb, but everything outside of the tomb was, as far as we know, or as far as I know, was destroyed. And so there is very, very little record of this period that we call the Amarna period. And the Amarna period is this very brief period in which the Egyptians became monotheistic temporarily under the rulership of Akhenaten to worship specifically the sun god Aten. And we see this massive change in the artistic style, right? The stylized nature of art is completely different. It's completely different here. And that's really fascinating because it's one of these clear demonstrations that when your religious beliefs and practices change, your art changes as well. Now, you guys are probably all familiar with this image. This is King Tut, right? Or Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun was actually son of Akhenaten, or an ancestor of Akhenaten. He ruled briefly, as you guys probably know. He was pharaoh briefly. He died at 19 years old. The interesting thing about Tutankhamun is he was not an important pharaonic ruler. He didn't do anything really specifically important during his rule. What's really fascinating, what's really important about King Tut is that when archaeologists went exploring in the Valley of the Kings or the Valley of the Queens, they found that so many of these tombs had been raided. So a lot of the tombs, like the pyramids, were raided thousands of years ago. And so the availability and the access to what how wealthy and how powerful they were, and the kinds of art they had inside of their tombs and things like that, oftentimes would be things like paintings on the wall that were literally stuck to the wall that a robber or someone coming to rob the tomb couldn't take. So when they found this in the 1920s, it was the most complete find ever of a pharaoh. And that's kind of what's significant. Because if you consider for a moment that he was only 19 years old that when he died, and he wasn't a particularly powerful ruler in any way, shape, or form. But if you go and you look at his sarcophagus, and his sarcophagus is covered in gold, and there's an inner sarcophagus that's also covered in gold, and then I think there's the larger stone tomb, then there's the gold sarcophagus inside of that, and then there's a smaller sarcophagus, which, if I remember correctly, only covers the top portion of the mummy, and then there's the wrapped mummified body inside of that. And to sort of see the elaborate wealth that was lavished onto a pharaoh who could not have been pharaoh for very long and who could not have been particularly important, is just, it's mind-boggling, because it makes you think, and it helps you to imagine that, for someone like Khufu, who built the first pyramid and the largest pyramid, who was one of the most powerful rulers in Egypt, right? What would his tomb have looked like if this is what a 19-year-old's tomb looks like, right? And those are, the really interesting things. But the other thing is we see a naturalism that is kind of unprecedented in Egyptian art, and it might be because the material that they're using here is gold. But there's this portrayal of someone, and you look at it, and you know that it's probably idealized, meaning it's probably made to look perfect. But there's this sense that this is a true image of a person, as they really looked, right? And I think that's really fascinating. Is we can sort of look at this and see that this is a very naturalistic, meaning true to life, true to nature, image of this person. Now, there are lots of other things that stick to the stylized elements. So, for example, he's got a hood, like all pharaohs do. He's wearing a hood. The hood has the cobra and the vulture on it, Wedget, and the other name escapes me. But they're always sitting on the crown of the red crown of Egypt, or the unified red and white crown of Egypt. He carries a crook, which is a shepherd's crook, in one hand, and he carries a flail in another hand. And of course, a flail is for whipping things, and a crook is for pulling things. So it's kind of like, this is like a pull and a push, which should remind you of the rod and rope that we saw in the image of Hammurabi, because these are sort of implements that signify or symbolize the ability to get people to love you or fear you as a ruler. So they're likely implements of statesmanship that are associated, kind of like what we associate with like a scepter in other, in the Middle Ages and things like that. And then we see Wedget, again, the vulture. We also see the wings of Horus in other areas. A large quantity of hieroglyphs running down the front of this, and then this really beautiful, elaborate set of carnelian, which is the red stone, and lapis lazuli, and so they're just really lavish materials on this image of a pharaoh. The last image we're going to go over is this one right here, and this one is called the Judgment of Hunefer. And this is one of my favorite pieces to talk about in ancient Egypt, because it really does give us a great deal of insight, again, into the religious beliefs of the ancient Egyptians, and the practices that they engaged in. Beliefs and practices, it's really important to remember that these things always kind of go together, right? If you believe something, then you probably do something as a result. So it's important to always ask that question. If they believe this, what do they practice as a result? So, for example, we'll use Christianity as an example, because we're going to go to this example later on when we talk about like Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. You have the Last Supper where Christ broke bread with his disciples, and then they drank wine. And so you have this practice in the church. That's a belief, right? That's a belief that he said, one of you will betray me at this Last Supper, and he sort of knew that his end was coming. Um, and there's this sort of sense that that was that belief about those ideas, about that supper, about those things become a practice in the church where people go and they take communion and they share in the bread and wine. They believe it's the body and blood of Christ. So those beliefs inform the practices that occur within the church. The miracle of transubstantiation. So they believe that the body, or that the bread and wine actually becomes, at least in some of the Christian churches, not all of them. In some it's more symbolic, but in like the old Catholic Church, they believe that it was an actual miracle that occurred at every Mass. The transubstantiation of the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. So thinking about that, I simply mention that because we want to sort of understand what the beliefs are and how they inform the practices. And this does that a little bit for the ancient Egyptians. So what we see here is, as we sort of go through this, the narrative, and we got to sort of pay attention to the narrative structure. So we've got these registers here that tell us, there's a couple different ways to read this. The thing reads pretty clearly from left to right. And you'll notice that we've got this image of this person right here. And he appears in a couple different areas. He appears over here again, and then he appears up here as well. And that's Hunefer, right? That's Hunefer. And Hunefer is being guided through to essentially the afterlife by the gods themselves. And so you have the jackal-headed god here, who holds an ankh in his hand. If I remember correctly, is Thoth, leads him to a scale. The scale here, they're weighing things, and this is kind of interesting. As they do this, they put a jar on this side, and they put a feather on this side. The jar is a canopic jar, and the canopic jar, as I mentioned earlier, probably held like the heart, and was probably symbolic representation of the sins that the Egyptian had engaged in, right? And the feather, it goes back to this story that is told in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, that if your heart, or if you are light of sin, lighter than a feather, right? If you have less sins, then when your heart is weighed against a feather, it will weigh less. So they're weighing his heart against the feather. Now, what would happen normally? Feather would go up, right, and the jar would go down because it'd be heavier, right? Maybe because it's a jar, maybe because it's filled with sins. I don't really know, but it's kind of interesting because Hunefer has the jackal-headed god sort of on his side. You notice he's grasping this little piece right here, as if to kind of like pull this side down to keep it lower. And if you look really closely, it's actually lower than the other side. So it's almost as though the images themselves are helping to guide Hunefer through these tests. And we know that according to the Book of the Dead, when an Egyptian person dies, they go through several tests, and one of them is the weighing of the soul, right? Reminds me a lot of like a Last Judgment scene that we'll look at in Christianity, where Christ is weighing the dead and casting some down into hell and raising others up into heaven. And that's kind of what's going on here, because as they weigh the soul, you have Ma'at standing by, who's part crocodile, part lion, part hippo. Hippos, by the way, were the epitome of evil in ancient Egypt. And it is waiting to devour the heart of the transgressor. So if he's sinful, then Ma'at will eat your soul, which is crazy, right? And then we have the ibis here, and I don't remember the name of the god, recording all of these things. And then, of course, Horus, who is the pharaoh, right? And you'll notice he's still got his bull tail down here. This is like 1500s, somewhere around there. This is over 2,000 years after the creation of the Palette of Narmer, and yet the gods still have little details like that. Think about how consistent that iconographic language is. It's incredible. And so Osiris is welcoming him to the realm of the dead here. And here we have the king of the dead, who is it's Osiris. I almost forgot. And Osiris is this is his realm, the king of the dead. And you'll notice he has a pharaonic crown and a crook and a flail symbolizing his control. You also have these interesting images portraying, like once again, Papyrus, and these are his daughters. And so he's being welcomed in. So what we believe that this sort of papyrus is, this papyrus was literally found rolled up in Hunefer's sarcophagus. And Hunefer was a wealthy, powerful individual. And we believe that what happens is that when you die, you're going to go through these tests. And that's what Egyptians believe. And they hope that they pass those tests. But to go a step further, the wealthy and powerful amongst the Egyptians would actually craft, they would have artists craft their own Book of the Dead with themselves in it, in which they're being led through and passing the tests. And again, remember, there's this belief in ancient Egypt that the Ka, the soul, can reside in these images. And so it was believed that if they could have the image of the person passing the test, then the person themselves would pass the test, right? And so they're ensuring their afterlife. And that's kind of like the big overarching idea here, is that the practice is you're going to create your own Book of the Dead in order to ensure that you arrive in heaven safely with Osiris. So there you go. That's really cool stuff. I wanted to end with this image. And the reason I wanted to end with this image is because as we were talking about and looking at the judgment of Hunefer, we could tell there was a great deal of continuity. I swear I can spell. I guess it's Continuity. Continuity means continuous. So we saw things that just didn't change. Certain styles, the images, the way they portrayed idealized facial features. Remember, this is an Old Kingdom image, and you look at this Old Kingdom image of Menkaure, and you compare it to this New Kingdom image of King Tut, and there are some differences, but they look very much the same. The same hood, the same sort of beautiful face, right? Very much the same. We looked at this image of Horus. Horus is still in composite pose. His pose is almost identical to the pose of Narmer, literally over 1,000 years earlier before on the palette of Narmer. He still has a bull's tail, right? So there's all of these things that continue. It is one of the most continuous styles. The style is so continuous. There's very little change. There's that one period of change that we call the Amarna period, right? Where the style is thrown out of the window for the life of a single pharaoh, right? But this is really the story of Egypt is the story of preservation, the story of preserving not only the bodies and the tombs and the afterlife, but also the style and the religion in this life. And it's a story of monumentality and using durable materials to ensure a legacy that these things will never change, right? And so I think that's a really interesting and a really important thing to consider, especially when we look over at some of these other objects. Now, I know we haven't studied the Greeks yet, but I wanted you to sort of take a look at these two Greek statues, which we're going to be studying in our next unit, because I wanted you to just sort of think about how these compare to the Egyptian pieces and how they compare also to these early Sumerian pieces, right? So we look at these early Sumerian pieces, and if we were to take these early Sumerian pieces and compare these depictions of the human form to later depictions, like, for example, on the Apadana in Persia, they're not the same. There are some static things, like, for example, the clasped hands signifying piety. We see that in Sumeria, we see that in Babylonia. We do see a tendency towards abstraction or simplification, especially using geometric shapes, right? We see that in Sumeria. When we move over to Greece, you'll see that their interest in naturalism is much greater. Their interest in naturalism is much greater than either in Sumeria or Egypt. They're much more interested in how people looked naturally. They painted these images, they painted their eyes, they painted their hair, and they really wanted to create sort of more naturalistic images. And so here we have three different cultures that each rest in different areas of the Mediterranean, all interacting through trade. And we can also see their interactions through trade as well. So, for example, you'll notice that in most images of an Egyptian, the Egyptian always has one foot forward, and it's usually that right foot resting backward and that left foot sort of projecting forward. And you'll notice that over here we have this image of this man here from ancient Greece. Is actually from Athens. This is an image of a deceased soldier. So these are both funerary objects, and they're both utilizing that step forward. So we think that the Greeks may have actually borrowed some ideas and religious concepts from the Egyptians. We know that they also borrowed from the Sumerians as well. So, for example, when we look at Sumerian images, so for example, if we go and we look one back here at these Lamassu, you'll notice these exaggeratedly beautiful plaited hair where all of the hair is braided and there's like objects that are braided into them. And you'll see that those plates also pop up over here on the Greeks, right? There is one major difference, which is the concept of nudity, which we're going to explore when we get into ancient Greece. But we sort of realize when we look at those things that these cultures are carving one path, and that the Greeks are much more open. They're looking at what other people are doing, and they're bringing these sort of ideas in, and taking the best ideas from different people and things like that. So those were some things I wanted you guys to think about. I wanted you guys to think about influence, right? This is a good opportunity for us to think about. It's a question we haven't really answered yet about the influence of other cultures on groups of people. So that's it for today. Thank